Welcome to Igniting Conversation and Action. Today I have Marian Casey-Maslen from CDAC Network. Welcome, Casey. Welcome, Marian. I always get mixed up with your name for some reason. How are you today?
I'm good, Lana. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
So tell me a little bit about CDAC and the work that you do.
CDAC Network was formed about 12 years ago to address a gap which was identified about making sure that communities were not kept in the dark and that they were really much more aware of how to address issues themselves in the lead up to a disaster and during and after a disaster. So in other words, that they could shape their own responses. And we felt that one of the greatest accountability gaps was around communication, and especially the two-way communication and dialogue and their involvement in crisis. So a number of agencies, UN agencies, NGOs, media development agencies, and specialized agencies, and the Red Cross movement came together. So not the usual suspects. You wouldn't normally have the media development agencies talking with other agencies 12 years ago. So it's about trying to get everyone to work together to have a much more systematic way of addressing communication and community engagement in times of disaster.
And I guess this is why I thought it would be so interesting to talk to you today, because around the world, which is a pretty big place, there hasn't really been a focus on the inclusion of people with diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, expressions, and sex characteristics within communications as an aid program. And yet, because of the exclusion and discrimination that LGBT people face, they are often the first responders. They're often groups that we don't think about accountability to in crises. And so I thought it'd be a really good conversation to be able to start thinking about and unpacking why it could be an issue, why we need to, think about it and unpack it as an issue, and potentially what kind of ways could we move forward as humanitarian and development sectors for diverse SOGIESC inclusion. So today's not about having all the answers, but about starting to think about what some of the issues might be in terms of diverse SOGIESC people in crises, and what accountability to that particular or those particular crisis affected communities, what that could look like or what that might mean.
Yes, and then I suppose generally in the humanitarian sector, we would have a self-realization that we're not very good at talking about diversity or dealing with diversity at the best of times. We've always struggled for decades in how to include vulnerable populations and minority groups. And with the additional recognition that we must do more for LGBTI rights, or SOGIESC communities, diverse SOGIESC communities, I think we now realize that we have to do more than talking about vulnerability, and we have to dig down into what that means. Recently, I saw a survey from the Interagency Standing Committee at the coordination level of the humanitarian system, which looked at many different projects, more than 1,000 projects, and only about 1% had considered LGBTIQ rights and their inclusion in the consultation process. And we all know there are major protection issues linked to inclusion with many groups who are persecuted or who are oppressed and by many social or religious constraints. And I think these are areas that people have been treading carefully. And I think that some people would say maybe treading a bit too carefully, in that we talk about do no harm, and the big distinction between doing no harm and doing nothing. I suppose we're at the stage now where people are recognizing much more that we have to do something much more intentional and concretely about SOGIESC communities, diverse SOGIESC communities. And this is where for us in CDAC Network, talking to you and your colleagues in EduFect and 42 Degrees, We see you as experts in this area that can guide us and help us, because it's an area that we're struggling with. For CDAC, I suppose we need to understand the full spectrum of information and communication ecosystems in every community. And I suppose what COVID has shown us is that in every community across the globe, we have been very bad at actually understanding our own communities and the diversity that exists within that.
Yeah, I think that there's a few things that, particularly around communication, that we need to consider when we're talking about diverse SOGIESC communities. And one is the use of communication mechanisms and strategies to blame LGBTIQ plus people for the disasters, and how we see that in social media, in memes, in newspapers, in news reports, and so forth. On the other side of the coin, I think to consider, what are the communication strategies that LGBT people generally have, how that is disrupted in disasters. For example, whether it's being able to access the internet after a cyclone, or for example, in COVID, in some of the research projects that I'm currently working in, because of the huge impact it's had on livelihoods, on job security, people selling things like their phones so that they can have a meal to eat, and therefore having even less options for communicating with their communities, with safe services. And so it's not about having all the answers to everything, but just to share with people that it's a pretty tricky and complex situation that we're talking about when we're talking about communication and we're talking about people with diverse SOGIESC, and certainly safety of communication as well, being able to communicate safely without that further being used as a target. And so maybe, I guess the first thing is that we always create an assumption as a system, or as a community of systems, that it's really important for public media, government, and crisis-affected communities to be involved in a communication strategy. But sometimes the media and the government are the people that discriminate. And that's a pretty tricky place to be in, isn't it?
Yes, I think I would agree with you there. I think there's some maybe entry points that we're learning where we can do more. One is, I was struck by a comment by your colleague, Emily Dwyer, when she was presenting on our annual event in CDAC last year on algorithmic accountability. And she mentioned that if you're not in the data, you're not in the analysis. And if we look at how we do needs assessments in the humanitarian sector, I think we need to look much more carefully at bringing in more non-binary options, so that people who want to put forward their identity are given that option in all of our assessments, but also that we are aware that this brings with it protection issues, and we cater for that. And I suppose when I read your reports from different regions, getting to know groups of diverse SOGIESC communities and rainbow communities in different countries is a good starting point, and taking the cues from them. We know that every country is so different in how we address those issues. And I think we need to be guided by people who live their daily lives and want to belong as part of a community. And it's not just their SOGIESC characteristics we need to talk about, it's how they live within that community in all their being. And I think we need to ask them to guide us in how to best address that if they are having difficulties in their countries with their governments, or if they're being portrayed negatively in the media, or if there are religious constraints, that we work with them to try to limit the risks and to protect them better, but not to increase their visibility where they want that to be increased, but to also be cognizant of countries where they want to be invisible and remain invisible. And that's the saddest part, I think, of this issue in many countries. I spoke more recently to a colleague of mine who sits in a country in Eastern Africa, and really felt that many of the community that she knows there want to remain invisible, which is very sad. And I think we need to really come to grips with knowing how to address that, but working with the diverse SOGIESC communities in doing that.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think one of the things that we understand better is the importance that local communities play, local LGBTIQ plus or diverse SOGIESC plus communities play in as first responders for their own communities, because there is exclusion in the humanitarian system, and that exclusion goes from the very beginning, for example, in the way that we collect data, the people who are targeted in rapid needs assessments, the assumptions that we make about people in the way that we collect that data in rapid needs assessments. Yes. And a difference between, I think, talking about localization or talking about accountability to crisis affected communities as a slogan within the systems that we work in, but also what you're talking about is a practice of accountability, a practice of localization, a practice of being not Western people coming in and telling people what they have to do, but really going and saying, what is it that you want and how can we support that? I think, and as much as people say they understand accountability or localization, I think that that's not something that happens as much as it should happen.
Yes, I think I would agree with you there. And I think often starting points for the aid organizations are creating that awareness within their own organization, and those biases and prejudices we all have. We grew up in different environments. I grew up in Ireland, in the west of Ireland, where we had different understandings and interpretations of what this all meant. So I think we're all learning, and especially my age group, we're learning a lot about how things have changed. And if we all need to start reflecting on our own policies, have we looked at our gender policy recently? Is it still binary? Are we still talking about male and female only? Have we included wider non-binary elements? And have we created that sense of belonging for people? We're all humanitarian workers. We have to have humanity at the heart of what we're doing. And we all, I think, understand and know the definitions of humanity. And it's about, human suffering must be addressed wherever it's found, and that it must protect life and health and ensure respect for human beings. So if you're a humanitarian worker, you don't have that respect for all individuals, and recognizing people for who they are, as we've said in many different contexts over the years, I think we're not really being true to our humanitarian mandate. And I think these are issues that we need to grasp much more and have much more systematic ways. But I think systematic within context, knowing the context is critical.
You're right. Knowing the context is critical. And I think there's a term that's being used just a little bit, but I think one that's relevant, particularly when we talk about invisibility. And I think that the term is called coming in rather than coming out. So the term coming out is pretty well known in places like Australia and the UK and America, and it's an assumption that we have to come out and say who we are in terms of our gender and in terms of our sexuality, particularly if it's not the usual. So I come out as a lesbian, but another woman next to me doesn't have to come out as heterosexual or come out as straight. When there is security issues, when there's discrimination issues, sometimes we talk about coming in, and that is, I might not tell the world that I'm a lesbian. I might tell only people that that information is safe and secure too, because it provides an opportunity to get a particular type of need met by a particular person or organizational service. So I might not be out to everyone, but maybe my doctor knows because of SRHR or sexual health reasons. And I think that when we're talking about or working in places where there are people of diverse SOGIESC that do face discrimination and stigma and exclusion and sometimes criminalization, what tends to happen in emergencies is that they use informal networks to share information, to communicate, and to be able to have access resource through those informal networks. And so there is communication happening, there is needs happening, but it's happening independently and separately from the humanitarian system, because they believe through all sorts of reasons that the humanitarian system discriminates against them. It might be because the data is not captured, it might be because, for example, a shelter is in a local church, and they might not feel safe there. There could be all sorts of reasons. But I guess my point is that when we're starting to think about communication and disaster, we need to think about it before the disaster happens. We need to think about disaster risk reduction and the importance of communication for diverse SOGIESC communities and for the systems themselves to think about this way before a disaster happens. Yeah.
So yes, and I suppose for CDAC, we would say that this goes even beyond diverse SOGIESC communities. You know, for all sorts of disasters, unless you have that pre-positioning of relationships in advance, it's very hard to create that relationship during a disaster. So I agree with you when it comes to diverse SOGIESC. We also, I think, if we're talking about relationships, they need to be groups who focus on that area, need to be at the table as part of preparedness plans. And people need to know who they are and understand them and recognize them and recognize their voice and give value, equal value to their voices around the table. And this cannot happen in the midst of a disaster. I suppose this is why we would say you need those pre-positioned national platforms in different countries or subnational, so that people already know who these people are and that you have that rapport with them, and that you are jointly trying to recognize entry points for how to make sure that anybody who self-identifies under those categories feels that they are protected and that their own health and safety is actually given priority during any response. So yes, I think it's about prepositioning those relationships and partnerships in advance. That's key. Of course, that's very difficult in countries where people are criminalized and persecuted. It's easier in some other contexts. But, you know, I've been reading a bit more about COVID in the context of LGBTI, and I was struck by the problems in countries around me. I'm currently I live in the UK, and it's been very tricky for people at end of life situations who are from the SOGIESC communities, because the recognition of your biological families or non-biological families, all of those issues have come to the fore. We have lost over 100,000 people, major crisis. And a lot of those issues are now really coming up about how people from diverse SOGIESC communities need greater recognition within the health sphere, especially, and also prejudice that arise when they're seriously ill, and when there are issues linked to powers of attorney, and who is your family and who's recognized as your partner. And these are issues that cut across the globe when it comes to this public health crisis. So I think there are issues we need to look at much more in our health sectors and across our humanitarian and development work. And I think this is where the links between humanitarian and development are coming closer together in how we look at diversity and inclusion, and especially the issues linked to intentional inclusion, which CDAC is hoping to look at much more. The word intentional is in there now in our new strategy. So it puts us under pressure to really seek out new ways of working.
Yeah, I love, and I knew that CDAC was working towards implementing and strategizing around what intentional inclusion means, and I really, really love that term, and I think that I'm gonna use it myself. If you don't mind, I will credit CDAC.
We probably took it from some of our members, so we specified it wide. We have a lot of members, I think, who are now using the word intentional, and they've guided us on this new strategy. So we're hoping they'll also help us and guide us in what that means, including yourselves as experts.
Because I think that the importance of intentional inclusion really creates the opportunity to think about where power sits, and coming back to communication, information is power. And so I think that there's a difference between having a seat at the table and then having a voice at the table, so to speak. I know that some of the challenges that different vulnerable or marginalized groups face is that sometimes even coming to the table, maybe, for example, being invited into cluster meetings, but people don't understand the system, they don't know the jargon, people have come in and might be speaking a language differently, so the cluster system might be using English, for example, where local community members might not be as fluent in English, not understanding how the cluster system works and where the power is. And so being able to work intentionally with crisis-affected communities and supporting their capacity to be able to have a voice at the table as well, I think really starts to think about some of the issues that we've had as a sector around power and sharing that power and having that accountability back to crisis-affected communities.
Yes, and I think I even see among many of the CDAC members, there's a lot of good work going on trying to promote that inclusion. And there's quite a bit of innovation, I think, going on there, including with our media development agencies, UN and NGOs and the Red Cross movement. And I think we can certainly learn from that. I suppose it's not at the scale yet where it's more systematic. It depends on the people. It's a personality driven way of working sometimes, which is not a bad starting point. I think sometimes you need champions, and I think that's always going to be important. But I do think it's that more systematic way of working where if we read a document tomorrow and 50% of the agencies say they consider LGBTIQI rights, but nothing appears in the narrative about them, does it mean they really are considering them? It can be the same for any other minority group or vulnerable or disproportionately disadvantaged group. And I think that this is something maybe we need to give a lot more thought to as agencies and as leaders, that we have to bring it to the front of our minds. Are we including these communities, these diverse communities?
Yeah, EdgeEffect actually is just releasing a report next week, but I know that you've looked at it. It's called The Only Way Is Up, and it does show that there is really not very much done in terms of LGBT inclusion in the humanitarian system. And I do have to say that the only reason why we've gotten as far as we have is because of champions, is because of individuals who may or may not identify as LGBT. Maybe they just are really committed to neutrality and humanity. But it is those champions that have advocated in their organizations, in their work, to become more inclusive. But that question remains, that you implied there, is how do we create that change in the system when that discrimination and stigma exists, when emergency managers may or may not know or understand the issues, when disinformation, including religious disaster narratives, exist blaming LGBT people, when, as you mentioned at the very beginning, people are sometimes so scared of doing harm that they do nothing and unintentionally do harm. So there's so much there to unpack and so much to move forward. Yeah.
I think, though, going back to the issues of data, I think if you are in the data sets, there is a strong chance that you're going to get more recognition, at least at that level, when it comes to the analysis. I think that's one area that is maybe the easiest part in some ways to address. Of course, if you want to get into the national statistics area, if you want to link the development and humanitarian, the needs assessments of the humanitarian sector, especially the international sector, should be something that should be relatively easy to address. It hasn't been 100% addressed yet, but I think these are areas where there could be concerted campaigns or approaches to change that. I think the individual organizations issues are the key. You know, who would have thought 20 years ago that we'd be talking about modern slavery and having that as part of our ethical training in organizations? We really now have to have the diverse SOGIESC types of training in our organizations. The whole terminology of SOGIESC is very new to me. I think many people over in their 40s, 50s, 60s in the sector, and many of those are the leaders in our sector, are not as familiar with these terms as we should be. I had a steep learning curve and was embarrassed on many occasions by my colleagues who were lesbian or gay, who educated me on a day-to-day basis on what I should or shouldn't have in a policy, where I missed many years that I hadn't been engaged in these issues enough. And I believe that there are many people like me whose heart is in the right place, but we don't have that awareness, and we haven't evolved with the latest thinking and the concepts of gender and sexual identity. And I think these are issues that we need to dwell much more on. It could even include your workplace policies, even on dress codes. There's a lot of issues we need to look at and say, are you exclusionary by statements that you have in any of your internal policies? It's about accepting people as they are and that sense of belonging. And I think we have to go there quite a bit. I do think, though, there have been quite a lot of positive elements recently, and especially I think the UN resolutions linked to SOGI and LGBTI rights. I think there's some framework there. And I think that if we're in the humanitarian sphere, international humanitarian law and issues linked to, we talk about impartiality a lot in the context of humanitarianism. If we really bring that to the fore, that cannot exclude. If we talk about human rights law, if we use the word non-discrimination, for example, you know, we're really held to account by that. Of course, implementing that is always very different. But I think there's a framework there. We just need to be better at saying, well, how does that link to each of our thematic areas of work? In CDAC, we need to do a lot more on how does that link with better engagement and communication with communities, a two-way process, not just risk communication, the right to information. Are our basic rights addressed when it comes to information and communication? We're not always trying to change behaviors. We are in some contexts, and especially there are great approaches in the health sector when it comes to behavioral change and social change communication, but often it's about the basic right to information and the wider communication angles associated with that.
Yeah, I think you make really good points. I think that just going back to, I guess, the Human Rights Council, there has been resolutions, and from an edge effect perspective and 42 degrees perspective, we really use that as a hook to be able to justify why diverse SOGIESC inclusion happens, because it is one of the few international bodies or those resolutions that explicitly say we shouldn't be discriminating, and by excluding, we're discriminating. And I really loved hearing that from you, because I get so pessimistic sometimes, because outside of the Human Rights Council, we don't have any really robust, practical international policies in the humanitarian system. The SDGs don't explicitly include LGBTIQ or diverse SOGIESC. And so sometimes it feels like a real battle to justify this. And I find myself actually in debates where people argue that neutrality or impartiality means that, oh no, we don't focus on LGBT people because we're impartial. And yet at the same time, I would argue, because you're impartial, it means that you leave no one behind. It means that you do need to include LGBT people. And so I think that it's really promising that we're having these kinds of conversations where we're bringing this topic up, but it feels like we have so far to go.
We have, I suppose people might also say that when I started in the aid business, we talked about putting women at the front, and there has been progress there. Of course, there's a long way to go, but I was recently reading a UK survey, and I think that, you know, there's quite a lot of women leaders in different organizations currently, and there has been quite a change. It's still much less than it should be, but there are some changes there. But of course, it takes decades. But we hope that the biggest problem we have, I think, with diverse SOGIESC communities is it cannot take decades, because people their lives are at risk. In many communities, it's life and death when it comes to their environment, where there are oppressive government legislations linked to it, where there is religious considerations that are persecuting people. And I think that these are issues that we have to find some quick solutions, but more sustainable solutions. And I think then, while we can have we do need a global framework, but we do need to have that country context when it comes to trying to move the change. And I think there can be entry points. There will always be champions. I think if I look at my own country, champions have moved the diverse SOGIESC communities campaign to a much higher level often. Be some of them inside the church, some of them outside the church, a lot of non-church people. But I think it has come from all levels, irrespective of global teachings on religion. So I think there are many aspects that you can address as individuals to go beyond that. But of course, we've got to be really careful when it comes to people whose lives could be ended tomorrow because of their diverse SOGIESC characteristics.
It's really interesting thinking about information and the assumptions that we make around inclusion and exclusion. We had, as a sector, and particularly in the Pacific, a really horrible situation recently where one of our humanitarian peers was murdered in a hate crime just a week and a half ago. And there's this assumption, you know, in the country that he resided in, it was absolutely illegal. And yet there was a beautiful church service. There was people speaking out about hate crimes, about accepting LGBT people. And it reminds me of one of the projects that I'm working on in Fiji, which is about focusing on religious disaster narratives and disrupting those narratives that blame LGBT people. So in the project in Fiji with the Australia Pacific Climate Partnership, we bring together faith leaders, we bring together climate scientists and climate activists, and we bring together LGBT people to unpack where these narratives come from and build new narratives together around shared values of supporting their communities in disasters. And so although there is a lot of religious discrimination and it's very loud sometimes in different media outlets, what's actually happening on the ground, for example, is sometimes very different to what we hear, what the dominant narrative is. And the question of how do we share those new narratives? How do we share the knowledge and the information around the social situations? And it's so local, it's so specific, and we do need to know the communities that we're working in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think also, Lana, it points to the key role of media development agencies in a disaster preparedness and response scenario. And it can really help to change the narrative. I suppose there's been a lot of work done over the last 2 decades, especially in training journalists on how to address humanitarian situations. So they're not just presenting news about the victims or survivors, but they're also giving what some of our member agencies would call news that they can use to help them protect themselves. But it also helps to shape the narrative about how you describe, for example, people with diverse SOGIESC characteristics, about how they're not the source of the catastrophe. So it's about how to engage with that conversation and maybe to use those rumors that are spread by social media and to use as what we would call in the network a rumor tracking and management system, so that you can actually use that rumor sometimes for the benefit of getting the new narrative out and taking that and shaping it to help address the issue and clarifying the facts. So going for the facts rather than the fiction. And I think this is where there's been a lot of new innovative work done in the communication and community engagement sphere. And I think having the addition of media and media development sections of initiatives involved has really been beneficial to how we work. In the past, we always used agencies for broadcasting our messages. We're there still, yes, but we've gone a bit beyond that, including the media in helping to form the message with us, so that we actually do bring out the humanity aspects, that we bring out the issues linked to dignity, how we shape that narrative in a humanitarian crisis, going beyond the politics. And I think these are issues that I think are critical to how the different agencies work together in the future, not just the media development, but also with the private sector and any initiative or any private sector entity that's linked to communication. So I think these are ways in the future where we can actually work. And I think the Fiji example is a great one. In Fiji, we also work in Vanuatu with our colleagues and with the national disaster management authorities in both countries, trying to bring together all of the actors, in other words, pre-positioning relationships before the disaster happens as part of preparedness. And in that situation, for example, the Fiji Rainbow Pride organization would be there, the gender agencies, the FemLinks of the world, the disability groups in Fiji will be sitting around the table from the start. So they're not just an add-on. So it's about thinking that through as to who are the key actors and voices that might be disproportionately disadvantaged during a crisis and having them there from the start.
I do think that Fiji is doing some great stuff, and full disclosure, my dad is Fijian, my mum is Scottish, so I have a very strong connection to Fiji. But I think that the work that Shifting the Power Coalition and FemLink do is really good. It's and please, if you have further information, but the FemLink they've got the program Women's Weather Watch, which is disaster risk reduction and rapid kind of information and response information in disasters, focusing traditionally on women. But that organization actually also includes LGBT people, some of whom are women, some of whom are not, and working with for example, the Fiji Disability Organisation, which we have a relationship with, also that intersectionality of an amazing, strong community of trans women who are deaf, who are involved. And so being able to, it's been really important for us to be able to learn from the women's movement within the humanitarian system and the disability inclusion movement, but also acknowledging the intersections between them and being able to learn what worked well, what didn't work well, to give us some signposts for kind of work that we can do as well. Yeah.
Yes, I agree. And it's that intersectionality that's coming up quite a lot in discussions at the moment, which I think is going to be something we're going to have to address much more in the next decade.
Yeah, but that work there is really important and really interesting. And I guess that history of media development, you know, the work, I know, for example, the Feminist Media Organisation in Sri Lanka, and we've have a relationship with them and worked with them in the past, and other media development projects around the world as well. There's so much to learn from. Do you have any examples of some interesting media development projects that we can use to think about how we could work in the future?
I would say one area that we haven't addressed maybe more acutely is on the issue of diverse SOGIESC characteristics and the media, and even the wider community engagement angle. And that's something I think we do need to look at in the future. I do think this is maybe something we could look at from the Pacific, and we're very fortunate, and the Australian government is very supportive of working with groups of diverse SOGIESC characteristics, gender and disability. So I think these are areas that we can further much more. I think in many countries, if I look towards Bangladesh, for example, there's been a lot of excellent work done, sometimes behind the scenes, by humanitarian organizations and the media. And I thought it was quite reassuring to see more recently. I was looking at the media where the first trans woman presented on television in Bangladesh. And that was quite a historical milestone. And I think there are areas where a lot of humanitarian development actors have been supporting activities, often in the background. You mightn't always see them at the forefront, but I think there's a lot of good work going on by humanitarians that I think can and should continue. Sometimes I think having a public display is maybe not always the best approach in some countries where there's a lot of oppression still. And maybe some parts of the sector has not evolved as much as others, but I think there are ways to achieving a good outcome in the end. I think we need to do a lot more work specifically on the LGBTIQ issues linked to CCE. And I think I'm hoping that maybe you've prompted me by this invitation to do something as basic as a policy brief on what it means to actually have an intentional inclusion of diverse SOGIESC characteristics and communities in communication and community engagement. What does it mean? You know, how different is it from talking about gender? How different is it from talking about other areas of our work? And I think this is something that we will certainly follow through. And you can hold me to account on that one.
It's interesting that you talk about Bangladesh, because in our most recent report, The Only Way Is Up, it's one of the few places where there was some really good stuff happening. For example, inclusion of diverse SOGIESC and diverse SOGIESC CSOs in the gender and protection cluster there. But also I tend to daydream about possible things in my, you know, when I'm not quite so busy. And I saw in Bangladesh how Sesame Street is there working with kids as part of disaster communications strategies and supporting some of the some of the issues that children might face in Cox's Bazar. And I remember thinking like, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could get Sesame Street, that is known so much for its inclusion in all different ways, to be able to do something and have a gender non-conforming puppet working with, children in communities. There's so many possibilities. There's so many possibilities when we're talking about media development, when we're talking about media arts development, when we're talking about working with communities. I think that one of the things that we can be really hopeful about is the creativity that we can bring. And
Yes, and I think you're right. We need a bit more innovation there, but also building on what's worked outside the sphere. I think the big issue for me when it comes to talking about LGBTIQ rights and SOGIESC issues is the issue of trust. If I look at communication and community engagement, for example, there are so few entry points for discussing disaster issues with many LGBTIQ groups in countries where they are still oppressed. And we have to find entry points where we know they trust these individuals or groups. And we need to do a lot more preparedness work in identifying those avenues. And a much deeper dive into those issues. It's quite surface level at the moment. And I think trust and respect and the issues of dignity, we haven't really explored enough in the humanitarian sector when it comes to LGBTI issues. When we look at Cyclone Winston in the Pacific and Cyclone Harold, we've recently addressed Cyclone Harold, and there's been some much better communication overall. However, I don't know yet, or we don't know yet as CDAC, what the outcome was in the area of LGBTI communication. We don't know if they were actually addressed well. Sure, they probably weren't, but overall communication was much better. We do know that part because we believe of concerted efforts, both by the program we're working with, also with the NDMO and our colleagues in CARE and CARE Vanuatu. I think that I would be curious to know if there has been any research done on that, and if there will be any research done on that specifically. And this is where we will be calling on people like yourself, Lana, and your colleague, Emily, to see how we can actually have more of a research and evidence-based approach to looking at LGBTI issues post-disaster, and what should we be doing differently?
It's Vanuatu is a particularly interesting place. I held some training for NGO staff, particularly gender inclusion staff, yes. Around International Women's Day. Every year I do that. And it's thinking about which women, yes. And the term gender is much broader than women. And someone from a big INGO had said that they worked in Vanuatu for a long time and they knew the local LGBT organisation, but they were saying to me, I just have to understand that, it's illegal to be LGBT in Vanuatu. And I said, no, it's not. They decriminalised same-sex laws in 2007. And this practitioner was like, really? Yeah. And so for a start, that misinformation and communication around the legal situation. And yes, the social situation is really quite difficult there. The legal situation, not so much. And then in terms of Cyclone Harold and our work there, evaluating the inclusion of diverse SOGIESC people, because we were working with the local organisation there, which, as in many countries, came out of the HIV/AIDS work that had previously happened. It did focus on trans women and gay men as key populations. And And so that is one of the restrictions, or one of the challenges that we have, is what about people assigned female at birth? But putting that aside, in terms of our assessments and our work in Cyclone Harold, only 3 people that were interviewed had received a rapid needs assessment or had been invited to do a rapid needs assessment. There was huge amounts of discrimination and stigma that was existing by local community members and local humanitarian responders because of the social situation. And so I guess what we're saying is that communication is aid, and that as a system, we still have to be working together to be able to overcome some of the challenges that we have, being more inclusive, whether it's our data collection, whether it's the distribution of goods in Cyclone Gita in Vanuatu, for example. There's male lines and female lines for food distribution. And also thinking, before you're talking about who makes up a household, and that's where we get to see a little bit more around discrimination against sexual minorities, which are a little bit more unheard of and a little bit more invisible, as opposed to third gender minorities in global South contexts. And I guess what is really important, and something that I don't hear so much of, is the importance of, as community, as media development organisations and organisations such as CDAC, being genuine partners in aid distribution. And certainly, although I know CDAC and admire CDAC, and there's also other organisations, as you know Emily Dwyer, and she used to work for Internews and so forth. However, as a huge coalition as such of INGO and UN and private sector, we need to be working better together for a united approach. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And going back to the issue, as you know, we always in CDAC say that communication is aid in its own right. And we feel that it saves as many lives as does giving out food and water, as in if you have the right information, accurate information, reliable information at the right time, and in the right language, and from the person that you trust, or from different people or in channels that you trust, you can make your own decisions on your health and safety and how you plan your days in the midst of a disaster. And I think these are key. But the issue is the inclusion part, and how do we make sure that those avenues are addressed? In our new strategy of CDAC, we've mentioned the collective clout of the network. We have quite a lot of power in a small network. We're a small membership entity, but with key organizations that have the ability to make a change within their own organizations, which of course is a lot of change necessary there, and also in the sector as a whole. I think we have that potential in CDAC, at least, to look at the communication and information aspects of the accountability era. I would say that for CDAC, our big issue is always two-way communication. It has to be a dialogue. Informing people, yes, we've all done that for years, and often we've informed them whether it's the wrong information or not. We don't really know the communities enough, and we just dish out information. We've seen a lot of that in our own countries for COVID, and sometimes useful, sometimes maybe not so useful. We need to be a lot more discerning and understanding of the culture and the social and economic context in those communities. And I think this is where we can, as a network in CDAC, do quite a significant amount of work. Again, it goes back to country context and having some sort of pre-positioning of relationships and platforms there in advance, and building on that, and having our SOGIESC colleagues in that platform from the start, with our other agencies who might actually, or other groups that might be disproportionately disadvantaged. And I think we can have some inroads there. I think we also need to make sure that we take personal, especially as leaders, from any gender that we take personal accountability to make decisions with diversity and inclusion at the center of them. And that it's too easy to make a decision without that there, frankly. We can go down the easy route, but sometimes maybe the longer route might be to address much better the decisions when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And I think getting away from our traditional ways of working on accountability mechanisms, which are very much about the sector, but we make them much more about the response at the national and local level. And we have our decision-making and inclusion and diversity issues very much linked to that. We need to really look at the insights of communities and the feedback linked to that. The word feedback, I think, has become very much about mechanisms, accountability mechanisms. I think I much prefer the notion of the dialogue, that two-way relationship that you have with individuals and groups. And it's the depth of that relationship and the respect that you have, that mutual respect that you have for each other, that brings across the issues linked to humanity and puts the dignity, I think, at the center of all of our work. And we need to really go back to that line of thinking in our sophisticated humanitarian world.
So if I sum it up, we use our collective clout to build intentional inclusion so that we can have a two-way dialogue with crisis-affected communities to ensure that there's rapid and accurate information that supports dignity and respect.
Exactly, and that helps them to lead and shape the response. In other words, there are huge capabilities in every country for communities and groups to lead their own responses.
Yeah.
Even in countries where economic development may not be at the fore, but there are massive internal strengths and capacities and capabilities within individuals and communities. Yes.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with you. I think that from an age-effective position, because the system excludes diverse SOGIESC, people are the humanitarians themselves. They do the rapid response. They're the first responders. They're providing food, shelter. They're providing appropriate clothing and all sorts of things. They're already doing the work, and we can learn so much from them and support them. So that already exists. So we're about to wrap up, but I wanted to ask you, if we didn't have any restraints, any funding restraints, any restraints, whatever, what could you imagine for communication and diverse SOGIESC people and response?
Well, I would hope that with CDAC's work, and I can only talk about our work currently, that if we have a way of including diverse SOGIESC characteristics and people with diverse SOGIESC characteristics in our work, and a more systematic way of doing this, that we can transform how the sector approaches people with LGBTIQ. And I think that if we have that, we will create that sense of belonging, so that people are part of society and part of the overall response. And that in Emily's words, that they will be part of the data and they will be part of the analysis from the start. And if they're in countries where protection is an issue, that their information is protected and that they are protected, their safety and health and safety is protected. So I think we have that capacity to push the boundaries on the future for addressing diverse SOGIESC communities and rainbow communities, and having them included as part of our everyday work and that sense of belonging.
Well, with that vision, I'm so incredibly happy that, we know each other and that our organizations are in allyship with each other, because that's exactly what we want to work for, a better world, in short. Yeah. Any last comments or anything?
I think that for me, it's been fantastic talking with you. And then I suppose we've learned a lot over the last few years from linking with EduEffect. And now I've also seen more about 42 degrees. I do think that agencies like our own, who may not have been at the forefront of issues linked to LGBTIQ, I think need to do a lot more self-awareness of those issues. And I'm definitely going to be linking more with you as an individual on how to shape and change our own ways of working in CDAC to make that happen.
And just to be really clear, there's so much that we can learn from you as well around safe, accessible, inclusive communication strategies, and how we can learn from other work and be able to work better with our community. So I just want you to know that it is a dialogue between us two. There's so much for us to learn and be inspired from.
We're looking forward to it, Lana.
Okay, thank you so very much.
Thank you, and the very best of luck to you and EduEffect with all of your work.
Thank you. Bye.